so much for joining us today. We have with us Aryeh Lighthouse. Aryeh, you have an incredible story that ties to a new book that you put out. You were working in the White House under U.S. President Donald Trump, serving as really the chief advisor for our ambassador, the U.S. ambassador to Israel, David Friedman. And now you've written a book about some of the things that went on. It's called Let My People Know, incredible story of Middle East peace and what lies ahead. It's your take on the 4 years in that White House, and especially following the signing of the Abraham Accords. So there's been a few books that have come out about the Abraham Accords. So what makes yours different?
So great question. First of all, thank you so much for having me on. This is such an exciting thing to be able to talk about. And I'll sort of throw the question back to you. During the Oslo Accords, which did not work, during Camp David, which did work, various different episodes in Middle East peace. And if you remember growing up in middle school, there was like, look, you might be great, but you're never going to be able to do brain surgery. You're never going to figure out peace in the Middle East. And now peace in the Middle East is breaking out. And there is no one definitive look on peace in the Middle East. History will judge this based upon not 4 books, but 40 books or maybe 400 books. And therefore, and I'm very explicit in my introduction, I saw this from my perspective. And what was unique about me is I did not have a personal relationship with President Trump. I didn't have the chief relationship with Prime Minister Netanyahu, but I got to sit around people who I think will go down in history as great people. David Friedman, Mike Pompeo, Jared Kushner, Avi Berkowitz. And I got to sit with them and see how their relationships develop. But part of seeing how their relationships develop, I also got to be the first person on the ground in UAE, in Bahrain, in Sudan, in Morocco, and work not on the leadership level, but at that next level of the people who get stuff done. And my book is not about peace on a piece of paper. My book is about peace in between people.
Oh, incredible. And the Abraham Accords really have seemed to achieve that as we look at the accomplishments that we're seeing over the last couple of years, in terms of the people-to-people relations, the economic developments that are happening. And it really, as you said, the Abraham Accords achieved what people had decided had been impossible and had been impossible for decades, and really set the Middle East on a trajectory toward a broad regional peace. Just recently, President Biden was in the country. He talked much about the Abraham Accords with Israel, but also in his visit to Saudi Arabia. So, honestly, you said your book is about people who get things done. So how did you get this done?
So the way I got stuff done was I got to work for some of the most incredible people that I've ever met. We, and I'm using the royal we here, but we means David Friedman and Jared Kushner, Avi Berkowitz. These were unexperienced in the ways of diplomacy or inexperienced in the ways of diplomacy. And because of that, they were condemned by all the people who had practiced diplomacy for so many years as clearly unqualified. Now, you have to look at that. What is a qualification? Is a qualification somebody who studies things a lot, or is qualification somebody who gets done? And if I were to go ahead and say I have a problem to solve, I'd rather go to a businessman or woman to solve that problem than to an academic, because there's an ideal world that I wish we could all live in. Ideal worlds are so much fun because they're rainbows and unicorns and chocolate coins that just get put under your pillow every night. And then you've got a real world, which is terrorism, which is the price of energy, which is how do we connect with people even when the personalities are not perfectly aligned. And businessmen and women have to figure out how to make things happen, even if all of the pieces don't connect. And that's what we did. We were led by a businessman. We were led by a very unlikely president, President Trump, who led very unconventionally as an unconventional president. And his hires, whether it was David Friedman or Jared Kushner or others, looked at the Middle East and said, wait, all these professionals, all these so-called experts have been doing it this way for decades. What do they have to show for it? And if they don't have anything meaningful to show for it, perhaps we can look at it differently. And because we were unburdened by preconceptions or pre-misconceptions, they were able to get stuff done. And I, sorry for the long-winded answer, but even before looking at things differently, one of the primary things that Jared and David did was they went to the leaders of these countries, our allies, Israel, Saudi, UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, etc. And instead of talking, they listened. And I think what they heard was that the region today is different than the region was 10 years ago and 5 years ago and certainly 15 years ago. And by listening, they're like, oh, there are new data inputs here that we can do something with. And that set us off in the trajectory that ultimately turned into the Abraham Accords.
Incredible. Now, you were in the room for nearly every one of those major discussions and decisions involving the policy that was going to be eventually set forth. Share something from one of those meetings that, we'll find in your book, but that we might not know yet.
Thanks. So, and let my people know, it's actually really cool. I had the privilege of being part of conversations that a lot of people describe as pro-Israel. I want to be able to let people know they're not pro-Israel decisions. They're pro-America decisions. We didn't make Jerusalem the capital of Israel. Israel did that a long time ago. What we did is we recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. And by us not doing that for the 71 years where we didn't do that, or 70 years where we didn't do that, it was actually a decidedly un-American approach. Meaning in 1995, the U.S. Congress, by a broad bipartisan group consensus, passed the Jerusalem Embassy Act, which requires us to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, move our embassy there, open up the ambassador's house over there. And every president ran and said they would do it, and every president successfully did not do it. President Trump changed that. December 6, 2017, recognized Jerusalem. May 14, 2018, he moves the embassy to Jerusalem. Those were American acts. And because of watching these American acts happen, it was interesting to sit in the room with David Friedman, Jared Kushner, Mike Pompeo, Mike Pence, the president, and to be able to see these decisions get made. Now, the result of those decisions were very pro-Israel. But the result of those decisions, the cause of those decisions were purely pro-American. And being able to sit in the room as those decisions got made was incredibly historic because it took courage and conviction to make those decisions because the vast majority of the U.S. government was advising against those decisions.
Oh, interesting. Now, you're an Orthodox Jew. A lot of the people you just named are also Orthodox Jews, but you're, from Denver. You're actually a rabbi. I was reading in your bio. And then, it's interesting when you think about who we made peace with, which are, the Christians and the Muslims, really the Muslims, but with Christian influence also in the White House and in some of the people who were helping with the negotiations. As an Orthodox Jew from Denver, did you ever envision yourself brokering a peace deal in Dubai or in Morocco?
If I was a seasoned foreign policy diplomat who went to all the correct schools, I wouldn't have pictured that happening because it was thought to be impossible. And not only was it thought to be impossible, America told everybody it was impossible. And, one of the lessons that I learned was as soon as you define your own ceiling, that's your ceiling. If you're willing to look outside of that box, Jared Kushner is not even aware that there is a box, right? There was Middle East peace, and he said, let's get it done. And he wasn't interested in hearing why it couldn't happen. He was only interested in hearing why it could happen. And with David Friedman driving the train towards a very strong U.S.-Israel relationship, and Jared Kushner steering that same policy towards what is possible in the Middle East, those two didn't conflict with each other. They drove in parallel until we wound up at the same station called the Abraham Accords. And when you rightly point out that I am an Orthodox rabbi and I am from Denver, Colorado, and David Friedman is the son of a rabbi, and Jared is the grandchildren's son of Holocaust survivors. There was a lot of press that said, wouldn't the team be better if it incorporated a Muslim or it incorporated this Christian or something else like that? To me, that's the bigotry of lowest expectations. We showed up and said, how do we get something done that makes sense for America and our allies? I learned from David and from Jared to be unapologetic about who you are. And the best part about America is we're supposed to be unapologetic in terms of who we are. Something that I find horrific today is that it is safer for me to walk around with a kippah as an identifiable Orthodox Jew in Abu Dhabi and Dubai and Casablanca and Bahrain than it is New York City and Los Angeles. And that is horrific. Now, I'll tell you, Miami and Nashville and Dallas, it's not a problem. But there are cities where I have legitimate concern about walking around as an identifiable Jew. And what was interesting about the Abraham Accord countries, they don't run from religion, they embrace religion. And there's not a fight in between Islam and Christianity and Judaism. Really, there's a combination where we work together.
Now, in your book, you talk about some really difficult situations as well, including that one of the things that you were tasked with doing was making condolence calls during some of your visits here. Unfortunately, while we're making peace in some areas of the region, we are still struck by an unacceptable amount of terrorism here in the country. And you had a visit.
And any amount of terrorism is unacceptable.
Correct. Any amount. Correct.
And we tried very hard to prove that point. That I think Nikki Haley said very clearly that when some people push back and said, well, Israel has an Iron Dome. And she says, well, so who cares if Israel has Iron Dome? Does that mean that Israel's allowed to have an acceptable amount of income before it protects its citizens? It's the vernacular. We've lost the battle. I've spent so much time trying to explain to the pro-Israel community, if I hear another person stand up and say Israel has the right to defend itself, I'm going to pull what little hair I have left out. Israel doesn't have a right to defend itself. Israel has an obligation to defend itself, a legal obligation, a moral obligation. And we, the United States, as its ally, have to make sure Israel knows that it has a obligation to defend itself, not a right. You can question rights. You can't question obligations. I did not mean to cut you off. I get very passionate about
no, I think that was
issue.
That was definitely a worthwhile cut up over there for sure, because that was really important for people to hear. And I think, when we take it back to them, unfortunately, not everybody agrees with you. And on the Fast of Esther, you went to visit the wife of a victim of terror, had 13 children, and the end, you really concluded from that visit that you yourself were a foot soldier in the battle for moral equivalency. Explain to me what that means. First, what it is like to visit a victim of terror. Let's start with that. And how the U.S. can actually play a role, and you just touched on it a little bit, in stopping the baseless murder in the settlements or anywhere that it's happening inside the state of Israel.
Yeah, first of all, I'll push back on that slightly. I have no interest in seeing terror in Jerusalem or in Tel Aviv or in Haifa or in Ariel or in Efrat. Terror is terror. And there's this sort of concept that they're freedom fighters. These aren't freedom fighters. These are terrorists. And the goal of terror, we say the word so often we forget what it means. The goal of terrorism is to create a feeling of fear amongst the civilian population. That is the goal of terrorism. And you look at the Jews and these homes, and the Druze, it doesn't matter. It's indiscriminate. Jews, Christians, Muslims who get murdered by these terrorists. And you look at their ability to get up the next morning, and you can't feel anything but inspired. And to me, it's horrific that this is where you have to find inspiration from. So what is it like to walk into the home of the Shiva House? Three conflicting emotions. Number one is enormous pride that I get to represent the United States of America, to do something that is a mitzvah, it's a commandment, it provides some degree of comfort. And to be able to do that is extraordinarily meaningful. But I walk in normally feeling guilty, because we are the superpower. We are the moral voice for the world. And maybe there's a statement we should have made before. There's an action we could have taken. There's something that could have happened. And the United States of America, it's a big government. We're not perfect. We don't always make the right decisions, but you walk into a home and you see real ramifications of when the wrong decisions are made. And you just sort of think there how important that is. And the third thing is that there's a great degree of humility. There's a great degree of humility. You walk in, and to any of these homes, it could be a cousin, it could be a brother, it could be a sister, it could be a friend. And there's no way it's terrorism. It's random. It's done purely to incite fear. And part of that fear means that we need to be humble. We need to be cautious when we walk around, not in terms of our pride. We should have enormous pride. We should have humility and understand that each and every one of our decisions, each and every one of our statements makes a difference. Each and every one of our prayers matters. And maybe we didn't pray hard enough that day. Maybe we didn't make the right decisions. It's a humbling thing.
Wow. And just going back to the end of that question, the U.S. still can play a role. You have said, at least in your book, that we can set the U.S., myself, I'm an American citizen as well, American Israeli, and we want to stop the baseless murder that's going on. What can we as Americans do to play a role in that?
Yeah, lead with moral clarity. And here, when you look in the Middle East, there are two sort of competing, not competing, but two parallel theories. Number one is be strong or be dead. So you have to be strong. You've got no choice in terms of that. But the other is you have to be clear. And where there's no clarity, there is confusion. Where there's confusion, there's chaos. And where there's chaos, unfortunately, there normally is death. So you have to be clear. And when I talk about no moral equivalency, that means in previous administrations and the current administration, there's a condemnation of terror, because who likes terrorism? But at the same time that somebody condemns terror, there's this mealy mouth understanding that perhaps the Israelis, the Jews, shouldn't incite violence. Now, what does that mean, incite violence? That means living in Judea and Samaria somehow is inciting violence. That means that maybe living in Tel Aviv is somehow inciting violence. It's an insane proposition for the United States of America to have any equivalence to terrorism ever. That terrorism must be condemned full-heartedly always, and there needs to be conditions for that. So, for example, President Biden just was at a hospital in East Jerusalem that serves a Palestinian hospital network, and he gave money. And then he traveled the Gulf and raised money for those hospitals. Every person who needs healthcare should have access to healthcare. But when a leadership decides that they're going to take money and give it to incentivize terror over healthcare, it's not my job to fill in the gap. Not only is it not my job, it's my moral obligation to make sure that that gap is not filled in, because money is fungible. And if I'm paying for healthcare, that's more money to go ahead and pay for terror. Make leaders do what leaders are supposed to do, is to make hard decisions. And they should make those hard decisions correctly for the benefit of their people who need help, and not to the detriment to be able to cause terrorism. And so when we don't speak clearly about this, it's a mixed message. President Biden showed up to East Jerusalem. He took the Israeli flag off the car. He gave money to the Palestinians from East Jerusalem. He didn't show up and met with Abbas without any preconditions to somebody who still incentivizes terror. This is not leading with clarity. This is leading with moral ambiguity. And in this region, moral ambiguity begets terror. We have to stop that.
Understood. And just for our readers who may not be aware, what you're referring to is what we call pay to slay. The Palestinian Authority continues to fund terrorists or families of terrorists who are killed in terror attacks, if as part of their budgets, their annual budgets, taking away money from their community, the people who would otherwise need that money to fund things, as you said, like hospitals. So, now we've done a very practical piece here. The piece that you've signed, or that, I should say America and Morocco, Bahrain, and the United Arab Emirates have signed, is a practical piece, but it's also a religious piece. It's a monotheistic piece, let's call it, because as the geniusly calls in the United States, the Abraham Accords is bringing together the three Abrahamic faiths, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, for peace. And you also named your book, Let My People Know, which is a play on words from Let My People Go in Exodus. Is there something prophetic in your estimation about the Accords?
Yeah, I mean, look, in the history of the world, has anybody changed the world more than Abraham? Right? If you look at what the world looked like before Abraham, there was idolatry, there was paganism, there was no morality, because that's what happens with idolatry and paganism. And Abraham introduced the concept of monotheism and a moral code to the world, right? That was the single greatest shift in all of mankind history, in all of humankind history. And how did he do that? He did it as one person standing alone. Eventually was joined by his partner, Sarah, and the two of them changed the world forever. The Middle East has, up until the Abraham Accords, been condemned to repeating its mistakes and trials and tribulations and chaos that have been the Middle East for the last 75 years. The leadership of Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed from UAE, President Trump, Prime Minister Netanyahu made the commitment that the past will not dictate the future. And I don't know if that's prophecy, but that is absolutely leadership. That is what leaders need to do. And the second part of let my people know instead of let my people go is the following thing. The very first verse in the Bible teaches us that we have to be thankful for what it is that we have. And Rashi, one of the medieval commentators, describes that it's the bringing of the first fruits to the temple. And when you bring the first fruits to the temple, you do that because everything I worked hard to do doesn't belong to me. I'm a simple human being. I have humility, or I'm supposed to have humility. Belongs to you, God, because everything I can do, I can see, I can write, I can touch, I can feel, I can plant, I can grow. That's not me. It's not me. It's somebody else. It's a higher being. And let my people know is telling Americans that something happened. And if you can't recognize that something happened, you can't be grateful for it. You can't invest in it. You can't help it grow. The Biden administration up until now has chosen to sort of watch but not invest. I hope and I pray that they will invest and they will grow, because peace is not a Republican ideal. It's not a Democratic ideal. It's an American ideal. It's in our interest. We have to stop acting against our interests. But if the Biden administration is not going to embrace this, let's be ready. Let's have the American people ready to see a Middle East where our young men and women don't go to die, where young men and women go for pilgrimage, where young men and women go to learn, where young men and women go to connect. And that's the ultimate reunification of the children of Abraham and Sarah. So again, I'm not positive it's prophetic, but I'm absolutely positive that this is what God wants of us.
Incredible. Now, you mentioned President Biden, that he needs to be not just a bystander and watching, needs to be a little bit more active. So what do you think the Biden administration can do better to advance the Accords, specifically? And also, let's just maybe look at America's interests abroad more broadly during the next couple of years.
Yeah, so very simple directions. Number one, stand against Iran. Don't do it with conversation, do it with action. Iran is the greatest creator of terror in the region and throughout the world. Isolate them as best as humanly possible. If they come to some form of diplomatic agreement, that's a good deal. God bless them. If they don't, be prepared to be able to show that we can't have Iran act under a nuclear umbrella. They can't. We see what Russia does under a nuclear umbrella, and they're supposedly rational actors. Imagine Iran, which nobody has ever considered a rational actor, being able to conduct itself under the protection of a nuclear umbrella. Number two is, I'm pleased that the president is now saying the words Abraham Accords. Appoint somebody in charge of advancing the Abraham Accords. Sit down with the countries and say, how do I invest further in the Abraham Accords? Invite the ambassadors from the Abraham Accord countries to the next State of the Union and have every American representative stand up and applaud them on behalf of their countries for making courageous decisions for making the region safer. And then in terms of broadly foreign policy for President Biden, understand the United States of America is the greatest superpower in the history of the world. If you decide to retreat from that role, it will be filled, and it will be filled by Russia and Iran and China. Whether you want to assume the mantle of the leader of the free world or not, it doesn't make a difference to me. You've assumed it by being the president of the United States of America. Take that mantle and show the world that we have one superpower, and we need to demonstrate that. And whether that's in Taiwan or whether that's in Iran, whether it's in the Abraham Accords or whether it's with our southern border, you can't sort of do foreign policy. You have to fully do it, and it needs to be in America's interest.
Great. So thank you so much, for joining us today. Is there anything else before we close up that you feel that I should have asked you, or that you want to make sure that our readers, largely evangelical Christians, mostly in America, hear from you before we finish the conversation?
Well, I'd be embarrassed if I didn't give one more shameless plug for the book of Let My People Know. I think is a book that talks about the Middle East in a way that I think God would want us to talk about the Middle East, and progress and success in a way that I think we make him proud. But even more importantly than that, what can your listeners and viewers be able to do? And the answer is, we have to teach the love of America to each and every one of our kids. This confusion about how proud we have to be as Americans. The rest of the world is very confused by that. The rest of the world looks at me and says, I don't understand how you can't have the most proud nation in the world. And I know that the vast majority of your listeners and viewers are the backbone of that pride, but don't take the next generation for granted. If you don't know what your kids are learning in school, make sure you know. If you don't know what they're reading at home, make sure you know. If they don't know about our relationship with Israel and the Abraham Accords, teach them. If you don't do that, somebody else will, and it won't be the lesson that you want to teach them. So please don't take our country for granted. It is a gift. And if we don't appreciate that gift, God forbid, who knows what would happen.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for taking the time. Enjoy your stay in Israel, and hopefully we'll be able to talk again soon. Thanks so much.
Thank you. God bless. Thank you.